Victorian London in the mid-198th century was a city of contrasts. Stately mansions stood beside crowded slums. Elegant carriages rolled past piles of garbage. Smoke from coal fires darkened the sky. Open sewers ran through narrow streets. The air smelled of rotten soot. Most Londoners accepted these conditions as normal. Illness and death from cholera, typhoid, and smallpox were common. Children played near stagnant puddles. Dogs and horses scavenged among the waste. Street vendors called out across filth-choked alleys. Into this chaotic world stepped one man with a simple, radical idea. His name was Edgar Wallace. He was not a doctor or a member of the city council. He had no title and no formal education in science. But he carried with him a belief that chlorine could cleanse the city. Chloride of lime, or bleaching powder, was used by apothecaries to disinfect wounds and remove odors. Edgar saw it as more than a laboratory chemical. He saw it as a tool for public health. He imagined a cleaner London. Streets washed free of filth. Wells purified. Air made safer. At first, his idea earned ridicule. He was called a madman. Newspapers mocked him. Cartoons showed him stooping in a muddy lane, pouring chemicals into a gutter. "Beware the chlorine crazed," one headline read. Yet Edgar did not stop. He believed in action over debate. He bought a few gallons of chloride of lime. He mixed it with water. He set out at dawn one morning to his own neighborhood in Whitechapel. He knelt by a foul drain and poured the solution over the muck. He worked methodically. House by house. Street by street. Passers-by sneered. Some shouted. A few spat at his boots. Policemen approached. They asked his name. They warned him to stop. He insisted he was saving lives. By the end of the first week, the odor in that block had diminished. Rats scurried away. Neighbors noticed fewer coughs and fevers. Word spread quietly among local doctors. Some came to watch. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Edgar's experiment had begun. He did not realize then that his small act would ignite controversy across the city. It would challenge the authorities. It would force Londoners to confront their own filth. In the chapters ahead, we will explore Edgar Wallace's journey in full. We will trace the causes that drove him. We will follow his bold experiments. We will witness the public, scientific, and political reactions. And we will ask, was he a visionary ahead of his time, or simply a man consumed by a grand, impossible dream? Let us begin. London in the 1850s was a breeding ground for disease. The city's population had exploded from around 2 million in 1831 to over 3 million by 1851. Rapid urbanization outpaced any plan for sewers or waste removal. Human excrement and industrial runoff flowed unchecked into the River Thames. That same water was drawn for cooking, drinking, and washing. In 1848, a devastating cholera outbreak claimed over 14,000 lives in London. Newspapers described streets stained with blood and death carts rumbling through alleys. Public fear soared. The Board of Health was formed, but its recommendations were slow to implement. Most efforts focused on mapping the spread of disease, not on aggressive disinfection of the environment. Edgar Wallace grew up amid these crises. As a young boy, he witnessed neighbors stricken by typhus. He helped carry water from a well that smelled of sewage. He watched his own sister suffer a 3-day fever that doctors blamed on bad air. Years later, he would recall that childhood. I saw suffering that no child should see. His formal training never progressed beyond an apprenticeship at a local apothecary. Yet while mixing tinctures and ointments, he learned the basics of chemistry. He understood that some substances could kill pathogens. One dusty shelf held barrels of chloride of lime, used to disinfect hospital wards and remove foul odors from clothing. The apothecary often cautioned that it was too harsh for skin, but excellent for surfaces. In 1854, John Snow, a physician, traced a cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His work demonstrated the link between water and disease. But political inertia delayed broad adoption of his findings. Snow's pump handle was removed in September 1854, ending that outbreak, yet other hotspots persisted. Wallace studied Snow's research. He believed if chlorine could sanitize hospital floors, it could also purify streets and wells. He saw the city as a giant patient, rife with infection. His apothecary mentor, Mr. Cole, warned him, "Chlorine is no toy, Edgar. It must be used carefully." But Wallace was undeterred. He wrote letters to the Metropolitan Board of Works. He proposed a chlorine street washing initiative, arguing, "We are content to cleanse wounds of the body, yet we neglect the very ground on which our people walk, live, and breathe. If the streets and sewers were washed with a mild chloride solution daily, I believe we would see a dramatic reduction in cholera, typhoid, and fever." These letters received polite but dismissive replies. Officials called him enthusiastic and unorthodox. Clergymen dismissed him as a crank meddling in divine affairs. The press occasionally printed snippets, often under headlines like "Sanitation Sci-Fi" or "Bleach Bathers' Delusions." Friends and family worried. His father pleaded, "Edgar, stop this folly. They will lock you up." His fiancée, Mary Thompson, begged him to abandon this obsession. He refused. He felt time was short. More outbreaks loomed. In his journal, he wrote, "I will not stand idle while children perish for want of clean water. Let them call me mad, but I will see London cleansed." This resolve set the stage for his first bold actions. He purchased 5 gallons of bleaching powder, rented a wheelbarrow, and set out at dawn. The following chapter will recount those early experiments and the city's reaction. Early one spring morning in 1853, Edgar Wallace set out with a simple arsenal, a rented wheelbarrow, a large metal bucket, and 5 gallons of chloride of lime. He chose a modest block in Whitechapel, one of the city's poorest, most overcrowded districts. Narrow alleys funneled refuse into open drains. Children splashed in muddy puddles. Rats scurried among human waste. Edgar arrived at dawn, before the street vendors and grocers set up their stalls. He mixed 1 part chloride of lime with 4 parts water, stirring until the solution hissed and released a faint, sharp odor. He paused. He breathed in the cool air. And then, without hesitation, he knelt beside the nearest gutter and poured the milky liquid over the filth. Immediately, steam rose from the foul water. A pungent odor replaced the usual stench of garbage. Edgar watched as the mixture fizzed, bubbles forming on the surface. He stood and waited. When nothing dramatic happened, he moved on to the next section of street. House by house, drain by drain. By mid-morning, word had spread. A curious crowd gathered at the edge of the block. Some frowned. "Is he poisoning the water?" one woman asked. "Aye, looks like he's dumping chemicals," grumbled a dock worker. A local constable approached, notebook in hand. Edgar introduced himself calmly. "I'm Edgar Wallace. I'm disinfecting the streets. It may prevent disease." The constable scribbled. "Disinfecting, you say? By whose authority?" "By the authority of common sense," Edgar replied. The constable looked up. He sniffed. "Smells of bleach. We'll see about that." He warned Edgar not to repeat the act. But he did not arrest him. In the afternoon, Edgar returned home, exhausted but hopeful. The next day, he repeated the process on the same block, adding 2 more neighborhoods each week. He noted in his journal. Day 3, neighbors noticed less odor. Rats appear fewer. I must record health outcomes. But newspapers seized on the story. The Morning Chronicle ran a scathing editorial titled "Chlorine Maniac at Large." A cartoon depicted Edgar with a madman's grin, spraying streams of liquid onto a horrified Londoner. Despite the mockery, a few medical students visited the block to investigate. One, a Mr. Henry Barton, recorded in a notebook that families reported fewer stomach ailments. Yet he cautioned that the sample was too small to draw firm conclusions. Undeterred, Wallace expanded his experiments. He moved to Finsbury, a slightly better-off district, but still plagued by poor sanitation. He modified his solution, adding a small amount of lime to neutralize acidity. He distributed leaflets to housewives, explaining how to prepare the mixture and apply it to kitchens, doorsteps, and water cisterns. Reactions varied. Some housewives embraced the guidance, scrubbing threshold stones and cistern lids. They praised the fresh smell. Others refused, fearing damage to clothing or skin. A Mrs. Hargreaves declared, "I'll not risk ruining my linens for a fool's experiment." Local police noted a rise in complaints but were slow to act. No arrests occurred, but Wallace was summoned twice for questioning. At week 6, Edgar compiled his observations. 11 families treated their homes. Reports, 6 fewer cases of fever. For noted skin irritations. 1 child fainted from fumes, too close. Overall, promising. These figures he sent to Dr. Howard Simons, whose cautious interest turned into cautious support. Simons wrote back, "Your work is unconventional, but I advise formal observation. Let us collaborate on a controlled trial." This offer marked a turning point. Wallace realized that to gain credibility, he needed scientific backing. In the next chapter, we will see how he approached the medical community, and how his street-level successes became a matter of public debate. By summer of 1853, tabloid illustrations of Wallace, often exaggerated with goggles, gloves, and a manic grin, graced London's most popular papers. The Illustrated London News dubbed him the Bleach Baron. Satirical magazine Punch ran a limerick. "There once was a fellow named Ed, who poured bleach where others tread. The filth he attacked, but London fought back. The man's off his noble old head." Despite the humor, the tone wasn't uniformly negative. A handful of reform-minded publications saw potential. The Lancet, the leading medical journal, printed a letter to the editor from Dr. Howard Simons entitled, "A Curious Instance of Civic Disinfection." Though the gentleman's methods are informal and at times erratic, Simons wrote, "The premise that sanitation may thwart the spread of illness is not without foundation." This letter marked a pivot point. Wallace, once dismissed as a crank, was now under the gaze of the medical establishment. Not all doctors welcomed Wallace's experiments. Many were still wedded to miasma theory, the belief that disease was spread by bad air, not contaminated surfaces or water. They saw Wallace's crusade as quaint, perhaps dangerous. Dr. Mortimer Brand, a senior figure at the Royal College of Physicians, denounced him publicly. The indiscriminate application of chlorine may disrupt rather than disinfect. Science does not need zealots with wheelbarrows. Yet younger physicians, especially those working in overburdened hospitals, were intrigued. A few began trials of their own, inspired by Wallace's reports. At St. Bartholomew's Hospital, a nurse named Lydia Holloway began wiping down floors with diluted lime solution. She observed fewer infections among surgical patients, though the results were anecdotal. In response, Wallace formalized his process. He published a 12-page pamphlet, The People's Manual for Urban Disinfection. He distributed it for free at local libraries and church steps. Wallace's growing fame embarrassed city officials. The Board of Health, which had long struggled to implement sanitation reforms, now faced questions from Parliament. If a private citizen may cleanse a borough with bleach, why does the city not act more decisively? Asked MP William Hanbury. An internal investigation followed. Inspectors visited the neighborhoods touched by Wallace. Their report was conflicted. Positive, reduced odor, anecdotal reductions in fever cases, fewer visible rats. Negative, skin irritation, complaints about ruined clothes, strong chemical smell. The board's conclusion, no formal endorsement, but no outright ban. Wallace was free to continue, at his own risk. Among Londoners, reactions remained mixed. Some mocked him openly in the streets. Others asked for pamphlets, or left water buckets out for him to disinfect. In one touching account, a mother in Bermondsey invited Wallace to speak to her church group. She had lost 2 children to typhoid and was eager to hear of any preventative measure. If bleach will save a life, she told him, then let the whole street stink of it. Soon, imitation began. In Shoreditch, a grocer began bleaching his storefront daily. In Lambeth, a chimney sweep mixed his own disinfectant for use at home. A movement, small, scattered, uncoordinated, was taking shape. Predictably, not all reactions were favorable. A butcher sued Wallace for ruining a week's worth of meat with airborne bleach. The case was dismissed, but the press covered it gleefully. Wallace also faced a break-in at his small flat. Papers were scattered, his mixing bucket destroyed. Whether it was simple vandalism or targeted retaliation was never proven. In his journal, he wrote, "Truth does not arrive to applause. It trudges through fire and foolishness." Despite all this, Wallace pushed onward. He had no fortune, no institutional support, and now few illusions. But he had the attention of a city. And more importantly, he had results, however uneven. In the next chapter, we will examine how his methods evolved and how he engaged directly with scientific bodies, attempting to transform from eccentric into pioneer. By 1854, Edgar Wallace's crusade had shifted from neighborhood skirmishes with filth to a broader battle, one for recognition. He no longer sought only to cleanse the streets, he wanted to cleanse the mindset of a medical and bureaucratic establishment mired in outdated thinking. Yet in a society resistant to change, especially when it came from outsiders, that transformation would not come easily. Wallace began preparing formal presentations for local scientific societies. He compiled data from his journals, streets where bleach had been applied, days since last reported illness, notes from shopkeepers and clergy. It was amateur science, but it was earnest. He knew that anecdotes would never sway the skeptics, but patterns might. He also adjusted his tactics. No longer did he douse doorways without notice. Instead, he wrote to local councils in advance, offering free demonstrations. Some ignored him. A few invited him to speak. In February 1854, Wallace received a surprise invitation. The annual Royal Sanitation Symposium had accepted his abstract on the practical application of chlorine in public environments. Held in a stately hall in South Kensington, the symposium was attended by physicians, city planners, engineers, and bureaucrats. Wallace arrived with a worn satchel, his pamphlets reprinted, his voice practiced. He opened with a simple image. What if the cure for typhoid is not locked in a lab, but sloshing in a bucket? He spoke for 20 minutes. Some attendees chuckled when he described his ambush disinfections. Others took notes. A few stormed out when he criticized the city sewer system. The reaction was mixed, but it was not dismissive. That evening, 2 attendees approached him. One was Dr. Alice Bramley, a pioneering hygienist who had been studying disease spread in London's maternity wards. She found Wallace's observations remarkably consistent with her own. The other was Thomas Rowe, an engineer from Liverpool experimenting with chemical treatment in public cisterns. He asked to collaborate. Together, the trio began gathering more precise data. Bramley advised Wallace on sample collection. Rowe lent access to better equipment. By late spring, they published a joint letter in The Lancet titled, Observations on Urban Chlorination and Its Impacts on Communal Health. The letter drew fire from traditionalists, but also interest from city officials. Wallace was invited to speak before the London Board of Health. He prepared carefully. His suit was pressed. His data was rechecked. He stood in front of men who had once laughed at him and calmly laid out his results. At the end, one commissioner asked, "And what is it you want, Mr. Wallace?" He replied, "Only that you see what is plainly before you. Disease does not wait for policy." No formal resolution was passed. But a pilot project was approved, chlorinated washdowns in several city alleys during the summer. For Wallace, it felt like a small revolution, yet fame bred resentment. Some physicians called him a pretender. Sanitarians accused him of seeking personal glory. He received threatening letters. At one point, his image was mocked in Punch again, this time seated on a throne of bleach. But Wallace knew something they didn't: the tide was turning. By year's end, several hospitals had adopted internal disinfection protocols. 3 boroughs reported lower infection rates in neighborhoods treated by Wallace's method. And the public, once skeptical, now wrote to him asking for advice. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Wallace's work intersected with one of the greatest crises of Victorian London, the cholera outbreak of 1854, and how his campaign unexpectedly placed him at the center of a city in chaos. In the summer of 1854, London trembled under the shadow of a familiar terror, cholera. Dubbed the Blue Death for the way it turned its victim's skin a sickly hue, the disease had ravaged the city multiple times over the past decades. But this outbreak was different. It was faster, more widespread, and struck at the heart of the city's most densely populated neighborhoods. For Edgar Wallace, this was both a vindication and a nightmare. By mid-July, hospitals were overwhelmed. Dozens of cases turned into hundreds overnight. In Soho, entire streets fell silent except for the sounds of coughing and gurneys. The air, once filled with the clatter of carriages and market cries, was now heavy with dread. Wallace had warned this would come. His bleach runs had slowed since the spring, partially due to bureaucratic red tape and partially due to his focus on scientific advocacy. But now, seeing the disease spread street by street, he returned to action. He filled his cart with jugs of chlorinated lime and went door to door, offering to sanitize homes for free. Some turned him away, thinking he might bring the disease. Others welcomed him as a last hope. Inspired by early data, Wallace chose to focus his efforts on one particularly hard-hit block near Broad Street. Every morning, he sprayed stoops, drains, privies, and cellar doors. He encouraged residents to use diluted bleach indoors and leave windows open when possible. Coincidentally, or not, the infection rate in that block began to plateau. It didn't stop, but it spread slower than in surrounding areas. Dr. Alice Bramley began recording the anomaly. Thomas Rowe helped map infection vectors. Word of the clean block spread quickly. Newspapers began referring to Wallace as the bleach man of Broad Street. One article in the London Daily Register wrote, "While gentlemen of science bicker in their halls, one soot-faced labourer may have discovered a true barrier to death." It was during this crisis that Wallace crossed paths with another name now etched in history, Dr. John Snow. Snow, a physician and epidemiologist, had been investigating cholera's causes for years. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not believe in the miasma theory. Instead, he suspected contaminated water. Wallace's bleach work, while not water-focused, shared the same practical intent: stop disease at its source. The two met in early August, introduced by Bramley. At first, their methods seemed incompatible. Snow was a meticulous cartographer of disease cases, Wallace was a street-level sprayer of solutions. But they shared one conviction: the establishment wasn't doing enough. They began working in tandem. Snow plotted, Wallace cleaned. They tested water samples and compared death rates. When Snow famously convinced authorities to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, an action credited with halting that neighborhood's outbreak. Wallace was one of the few publicly supporting the move. Despite their progress, the establishment was slow to respond. The General Board of Health downplayed Snow's findings and dismissed Wallace's bleach work as folklore sanitation. A city official, in a closed meeting, was quoted as saying, "We cannot build policy on the ramblings of a house painter and a mapmaker." Still, the public had seen results. By late August, residents of other districts began asking for Wallace by name. Makeshift bleach teams, often volunteers, began copying his methods. In some areas, cases declined shortly after these interventions. Wallace published an open letter titled "Let the People Clean," urging neighborhoods to take sanitation into their own hands while the city debated. By September, the worst of the outbreak had passed. Thousands were dead. But Wallace's work had not gone unnoticed. A delegation of Soho residents petitioned for him to be awarded a formal city commendation. While no medal arrived, he was invited back to the Board of Health, this time as an expert witness. His testimony, combined with Snow's maps and Bramley's records, led to a quiet but notable shift in the city's sanitation policy. The following year, London's water companies began filtering and treating supplies more systematically. And while the official line credited structural reforms, many knew that a house painter with a bucket had helped save lives. In the next chapter, we will explore how Edgar Wallace's reputation grew, and how the man behind the myth struggled with the weight of unexpected fame. By the spring of 1855, Edgar Wallace was no longer just the bleach man. He was a figure of legend. For many in London's working-class districts, he represented defiance against disease, death, and a city that had long ignored their suffering. But with fame came friction. Following his testimony to the General Board of Health, Wallace was invited to speak at community halls, schools, and even scientific salons. He rarely turned these down, though he was never quite comfortable in the spotlight. Wearing his patched waistcoat and work boots, he stood out among suited gentlemen and corseted ladies. Wallace didn't speak in polished paragraphs. He spoke in paint-stained analogies and workman's logic. Yet his honesty captivated audiences. He told stories about scraping dried sewage off walls, about pouring bleach into gutters while aristocrats pinched their noses and crossed the street. He made sanitation visceral, urgent, and human. A theatre on Shoreditch High Street even staged a satirical play titled The Whitewasher General, loosely inspired by Wallace's story. The character, while comedic, was depicted as a hero. Wallace attended a performance once. He laughed. Then he left early. Despite his rising popularity, Wallace continued to encounter resistance from London's bureaucracy. His request to establish permanent sanitation teams in each borough, funded by the city, was dismissed as fiscally unrealistic. His call to produce a public bleach distribution plan? Unnecessary alarmism, according to one alderman. Wallace grew impatient. In letters to Dr. Alice Bramley, he wrote, "They clap when I speak but turn their backs when I ask for soap." To the public, he was a savior. To officials, he remained an outsider, a manual laborer meddling in policy. Frustrated, Wallace began publishing pamphlets. With help from Rowe, he printed dozens titled things like "Clean Streets Save Lives" and "Sanitation is Not Charity." Some were distributed in taverns. Others were posted on church doors. Though the cholera outbreak had shaken faith in the miasma theory, many still clung to it. Wallace, advocating for practical sanitation, was inadvertently pulled into debates he didn't want. Physicians debated whether bleach was fighting bacteria, odors, or merely creating a false sense of security. Some accused Wallace of distracting from real medicine. A letter in the Lancet called him a bleach peddler in a lab coat's disguise. Wallace didn't respond in kind. He kept working. Spraying, teaching, demonstrating. He showed citizens how to mix their own disinfectant, how to ventilate rooms, how to avoid waste buildup. He believed in action over argument. But the toll of his public crusade was mounting. Wallace's health began to suffer. Constant exposure to harsh chemicals, long hours in polluted environments, and poor diet led to respiratory problems. He developed a persistent cough and often lost his voice after speaking engagements. Financially, he remained modest. Donations helped, but he refused most offers of patronage. He lived in the same narrow brick flat in Lambeth. His hands remained cracked and stained. He also grew distant from former allies. Dr. Bramley, now leading a small public health unit, wrote to him less frequently. Rowe began working for a sanitary commission, bound by formal roles that left little room for Wallace's improvisations. Wallace was proud of their success but felt left behind. By late 1855, however, real change was finally visible. More neighborhoods had functioning drainage. Local councils authorized street sweeping teams. Public toilets appeared near marketplaces. And crucially, the word sanitation began appearing in Parliament debates. Wallace wasn't always named, but his influence was undeniable. In an interview with the London Chronicle, a councilman from Westminster remarked, "We owe as much to men who scrubbed the gutters as to those who penned the papers." One evening, sitting on a park bench near the Thames, Wallace reportedly told a young apprentice, "It ain't about bleach. It's about not giving up. A city that cleans itself shows it remembers its dead." In the next chapter, we'll look at Wallace's final campaign, a failed, but brave effort to bring his ideas to cities beyond London. By early 1856, Edgar Wallace had achieved the unthinkable, a laborer turned activist who altered how a metropolis thought about cleanliness. But London, for all its sprawl and smoke, was only one city. Wallace saw the same sickness, the same stench, mirrored in smaller towns across England, from Manchester to Norwich, Bristol to Hull. So he packed a duffel, loaded a trunk with pamphlets, and took his campaign on the road. Wallace travelled mostly by train, sometimes on foot. He sent word ahead to trade halls, charity groups, and town officials that a London sanitation man was coming. Some towns welcomed him warmly. Others were confused. A few thought he was a conman. He lectured in church basements, taverns, schoolyards, wherever people gathered. His voice was hoarse, his suit threadbare, but his words rang with urgency. In Birmingham, he demonstrated how to create a bleach mixture using soap ash and vinegar. In Leeds, he staged a mock epidemic drill, asking locals to identify possible contamination sites. In Bath, he worked with a group of laundresses to set up a public washhouse prototype. But while London had started to embrace reform, many provincial leaders clung to old ways. "We are not London," a mayor of a Midlands borough told him. "We do not have your filth." Wallace begged to differ. He pointed to overflowing privies, stagnant canals, and outbreaks of rashes and dysentery. In letters to Dr. Bramley, he wrote, "They wait for death before they clean. By then, it's too late." He faced hostility from factory owners who didn't want to invest in workers' health, from landowners who feared increased taxes, from clergy who insisted illness was a test from God. In one Yorkshire village, he was chased out by a crowd who thought he was spreading bleach to poison their wells. In another, a constable fined him for unauthorized mixing of chemicals in public. Despite setbacks, there were victories. A district in Newcastle adopted his mobile wash basin idea. A women's guild in Norwich began distributing his sanitation pamphlets to new mothers. A small grammar school in Brighton started a Clean Classrooms pledge after his visit. These wins didn't make headlines, but they mattered to Wallace. "A clean child," he said, "grows into a healthy citizen." News of his provincial work eventually reached Whitehall. A backbench MP cited Wallace's travels in a sanitation reform debate. He was invited, reluctantly, back to London to give a briefing. His presentation to the Parliamentary Health Subcommittee was brief but passionate. He handed them a box of collected waste samples, tagged by town. "This is England," he said. "Not just soot and gas lamps, but waste and wet shoes." Though his proposal for a nationwide sanitation grant program was tabled, the session planted seeds. Wallace returned to London that summer, thinner and sicker. Years of chemical exposure, poor sleep, and inconsistent meals had aged him prematurely. Friends noticed his walk slowed, his cough deepened. He spent more time writing, mentoring young volunteers, and consulting with charities. Though the man who once washed streets with bleach was now largely desk-bound, his influence continued through others. He remained hopeful. "Progress," he said, "is a puddle that becomes a stream. And a stream can clean the stone." He started writing more often. At first, for himself. Later, for those who kept asking. His replies were steady, in careful handwriting, as if he still had the strength to come wash a floor or hand out rags. Though he didn't. In a letter to a librarian in Yorkshire, he wrote, "If water flows the wrong way, it's not the fault of the water. It's the fault of the channel." In another, sent to a small rural school he'd never visited, "Let the children wash their hands, even if the tap only runs cold. Cold water still cleans." He began collecting these letters in a folder. On the cover, handwritten, practical notes on sanitation, with examples. No one knew where he planned to send it. Maybe nowhere. That spring, he received word a parish in Kent had started a clean yard day, with carts, buckets, and clay brushes. The local vicar sent him a short note. "We're not sure what this is really for. But people smile. That's something." He read the note 3 times. Then filed it with the others, without replying. Sometimes, it was enough just to know. Wallace no longer gave talks. He no longer knocked on council doors, argued with police, or carried buckets. But he sent boxes. In the old shed, once filled with bleach and gloves, there were now stacks of pamphlets. Dust, dirt, and consequence. 10 simple rules for the city lamppost. How cleanliness saves time. Some sounded almost absurd, like, how to wash a bench in under 4 minutes. But they worked. One young volunteer, a 20-year-old from Manchester, wrote, "We leave your leaflets at the bakery, the pharmacy, even by the football ground. Sometimes people read them. Sometimes they laugh. But they read. It was a new kind of front. No street battles, no bleach, no noise. He called it the quiet work. And maybe it brought him a kind of peace. By summer, his condition worsened. Doctors spoke of his lungs, of chronic inflammation. He no longer climbed higher than the second floor. But he had a desk, a pen, a list of addresses. In a letter to the Birmingham Sanitation Office, he wrote, "You're not building a utopia. You're just keeping people from slipping on the stairs. That is the work." Many replies were formal, some indifferent. But more and more came thank yous. A nurse from Devon, an old gardener from Slough, a mother of 5 from Portsmouth. He began drawing a map, in pencil, slowly. Each dot marked a town where someone had read, shared, or changed something small. In the margins, he wrote short notes. Sink installed. Children clean shoes at entry. Watering can uses clean water. These were his victories. Unofficial, but real. In August, a young woman came to visit, a graduate from the London nursing school. She had read his pamphlet since she was 15. Now, she was head nurse at a clinic. They spoke softly. Mostly listened. At the end, she said, "You didn't just teach us to wash. You taught us not to walk past the dirt." He said nothing. Just nodded. When she left, he wrote her words in the same folder as the letters. By hand. Don't walk past the dirt. Autumn came. He stood by the window less and less. Books stayed unread. Some letters remained without envelopes. But the habit lived on. 1 letter a day. 1 idea per page. Not about himself, but about cleanliness. He once told a student, now grown, "Water without direction is a puddle. With direction, a stream. The meaning lies in the channel." And, as always, he smiled, not with his eyes, but with his voice. So the last weeks passed. No noise, no streets, no gloves. But every morning, a letter. Every week, the box. Every day, hope that somewhere, something got 1 broom cleaner. I'm not a sanitation reformer. I just don't like dirt where it can be cleared. The last line in his notebook, written the day before he stopped writing. It began with 1 bucket. Not a letter. Not a leaflet. A real, full bucket. That winter, he left his flat just before sunrise. No fanfare. He wore a coat 2 sizes too large, scarf tucked tightly, boots wrapped in waxed cloth. The air was sharp and damp, the kind that settles in bones. In his hand, a tin bucket with a handwritten label. Cleansing solution. Do not touch. Inside, a mild chlorine mixture, prepared overnight, measured to the gram. Safe for stone. Harsh on grime. He didn't speak as he walked. Just nodded to a milkman, stepped aside for a constable. He moved like someone heading to a quiet obligation. Which, in his mind, he was. He stopped on Millbridge Lane, a narrow street behind a bakery. Slippery cobbles. Bits of coal dust. Water pooled unevenly near a broken drain. He poured the solution carefully. One long streak along the curb. Then again, across a stepping path by the door. The smell came fast, sharp, sterile, unmistakable. 2 passers-by slowed, turned. That bleach. Smells like a hospital, that does. He didn't answer. He had no permit. No title. No escort. Just a notebook in his pocket, where he marked. The next day, he returned with more. This time, a second bucket. And a brush. The day after, a third bucket, donated by a charity kitchen. By the end of the week, he'd cleaned 8 corners in 3 streets. No signs. No speech. Just routine. A boy from a nearby tenement watched from the stairs. On the 4th day, he brought his own rag. "Can I help, mister?" Wallace nodded. Handed him gloves. The boy didn't speak much. But he came again the next day. By the end of the week, they worked in silence. Like clock hands. Quiet. Mechanical. In sync. On the 7th day, a local inspector arrived. "You can't just pour chemicals out here, sir." Wallace didn't argue. He offered the inspector a paper, hand-typed, titled "Non-Toxic Street Cleaning Mixtures and Their Evaporation Patterns in Cold Air." The inspector didn't read it. He just stared at the bucket, sighed, and walked away. Wallace wrote, "Millbridge Lane. Day 7. Reaction, institutional discomfort." Soon, the local bakery owner began washing her steps early. A teacher started wiping railings. A shop assistant swept the pavement before opening. No one called it a movement. It wasn't one. Just a mood. A shift. A mild, contagious sense of order. The newspapers never noticed. But one clerk from the city sanitation office walked the street one morning. Quietly. Without clipboard. The next week, his department ordered a small trial, community-led cleaning pilot zones. No mention of Wallace. He didn't mind. By late February, word had spread. A few more volunteers appeared, 2 students, a retired postman. They didn't ask for speeches. They asked for formulas. He started printing small cards. Solution number 1, bleach, diluted 120, salt, warm water. For stone paths. Solution number 2, vinegar and baking soda. For iron railings. Solution number 3, boiled linseed, soap, and water. For wood. He handed them out like recipe cards. Quietly. Without names. One night, someone chalked on a wall. Wallace Street, cleared by hand. The chalk washed away the next rain. But the name stayed in whispers. He never asked for credit. But he wrote in his notebook. Names are not important. Patterns are. By March, his health was again fading. His hands trembled more. Steps grew slower. But he still walked. One street. One curb. One small stain at a time. In a letter to an old friend, he wrote, "This is not reform. This is removal. Of dirt. Of the idea that it must stay. I don't fight cities. I fight residue." On the 15th day of the campaign, he fell while carrying a bucket. No one saw him fall. But someone helped him stand. And the next morning, 2 other people came to clean the same street, without being asked. Wallace watched from across the road. A city cleans itself, he wrote. Not when it is told, but when it remembers it can. The final time he stepped into the street, no one noticed. No article followed. No photograph was taken. No crowd formed. It was just another cold morning. Thin mist. Damp stones. A quiet echo of hooves. He walked slower than before. Each step measured. Each breath shallow. One hand clutched a folded cloth. The other, a worn notebook, edges curled, pages thinned from use. He wasn't carrying bleach this time. Only a small brush. He made his way to a familiar corner, back lane south, where the drain dipped slightly, always catching water. There he knelt. Wiped the stone twice. Stood. Waited. Watched. A few people passed. None stopped. A cart splashed by. One child laughed at the smell of vinegar in the air. He wrote a final note. Drain clear. Water flows west. Then closed the notebook. That evening, he didn't come home. Volunteers checked his usual places. Hospitals were called. Police notified. By midnight, he was found. Seated quietly on a bench under a railway arch, head leaned to one side. No pain on his face. Just sleep. In his coat pocket, a sealed envelope addressed simply. To the city. Inside, one sentence. If no one notices the clean street, that means it worked. He had no formal burial. No public service. But a quiet group of former volunteers, a baker, a nurse, a teacher, 2 schoolboys now grown, gathered weeks later. They washed a row of old lampposts in silence. No signs. No speeches. Only water and cloth. His notebooks were later archived by a local library. Rarely checked out. Occasionally quoted. His pamphlets, worn, odd, handwritten, showed up in school drawers, tucked into cleaning closets, sometimes scribbled over with shopping lists. But some were read. Years later, during a city council discussion on waste disposal, one official quoted from a leaflet long assumed anonymous. Cleanliness is not virtue. It's logistics. The room chuckled. But the line stuck. In a nursing school exam, a case study mentioned the Wallace method, an approach using small actions, repeated daily, without fanfare. Most students skipped the footnote. But one wrote a paper on it. A small grammar school in Brighton, the same one from years before, painted a mural behind the bike racks. A street. A bucket. And, in simple letters, leave it better than you found it. In the end, there was no monument. Just a shift. Pavement swept before opening hours. Benches wiped without being asked. New habits, passed hand to hand. He used to say, "The goal is not a clean city. The goal is a city that stays clean without remembering why." And maybe, without knowing, it happened. The final line, found in the back of his notebook. If water flows, it finds a way. If hands move, something changes. If no one sees it, perfect.